Some drawings are only pictures, others are promises that even kings cannot ignore. 8-year-old Charlotte Hayes had never seen the inside of Blackstone Manor before, and if anyone had asked, she would have happily kept it that way. Her mother cleaned offices 6 nights a week in downtown Boston, and whenever school ended, Charlotte waited quietly in the employee lounge with a coloring book that had more empty pages than colored ones. But today was different. A plumbing emergency had flooded the entire first floor of the office building where her mother worked, forcing everyone to leave early. One of the security supervisors called in a favor, arranging temporary cleaning work at a private estate nearly 40 miles outside the city. Charlotte rode beside her mother in an aging pickup truck that rattled every time it climbed another hill. The mansion appeared through the morning fog like something forgotten by time. Massive iron gates opened without a sound. Dark stone walls stretched across acres of perfectly trimmed gardens. Marble statues watched every visitor with expressionless faces. Charlotte pressed her forehead against the passenger window, wondering why such a beautiful place somehow felt colder than winter itself. Her mother reminded her of the rules before they even stepped inside. Stay close. Don't wander. Don't touch anything. Most importantly, don't bother the owner. Charlotte nodded obediently. She always did. Inside, the mansion seemed impossibly quiet. Chandeliers reflected soft golden light across polished marble floors. Tall windows allowed grey clouds to paint moving shadows along endless hallways. The air carried the faint scent of cedar wood, old books, and something strangely metallic she couldn't identify. Staff members moved carefully, speaking in whispers as though every sound mattered. Charlotte sat in a small waiting room near the grand staircase with a box of colored pencils she always carried in her backpack. She drew whenever she became nervous. Today, she drew castles surrounded by forests, birds flying beneath a full moon, and a lonely man sitting on a giant chair with nobody beside him. Less than half a mile away, hidden beneath the oldest wing of Blackstone Manor, Luca Moretti stood before a gathering that had waited centuries for his decision. The ancient throne room remained sealed from human eyes, its enormous black throne carved from volcanic stone older than recorded history. No visitor entered without permission, no child had ever crossed its threshold. Charlotte knew nothing about any of that. After nearly 2 hours, curiosity quietly defeated patience. She noticed a small wooden door standing slightly open near the end of a hallway. No guards, no warning signs, just silence. Thinking it might lead to another waiting room, she wandered inside. The corridor beyond grew cooler with every step. Candles flickered without wind. Portraits of unfamiliar faces seemed almost alive beneath layers of dustless glass. Finally, she reached an enormous chamber unlike anything she had imagined. At its center stood a magnificent black throne beneath towering stained glass windows. No ropes surrounded it, no one guarded it. To Charlotte, it looked less like a king's seat and more like the loneliest chair in the world. She walked closer, clutching her drawing. The picture had changed while she colored. Without planning it, she had added strange silver branches surrounding the lonely man. Above him floated a little girl holding a lantern. Charlotte tilted her head. She didn't remember drawing those branches. They looked too detailed for someone her age. She smiled anyway. Maybe the chair needed something cheerful. Carefully, she climbed the first marble step and laid the drawing neatly across the center of the throne's dark seat before whispering, "Nobody should have to sit alone." Then she hurried away, never noticing that the room had suddenly become unnaturally still. At that exact moment, Luca Moretti pushed open the massive throne room doors after concluding the shortest royal council meeting in decades. Advisors followed several steps behind, discussing treaties and ancient obligations in careful voices. Luca barely listened. His attention stopped the instant his eyes reached the throne. A single sheet of paper rested where nothing had ever been placed without his command. Every advisor froze. Every guard instinctively held their breath. But it wasn't the drawing itself that drained the color from the immortal king's face. It was the impossible symbol hidden among the child's innocent pencil strokes, a symbol that had disappeared from the world over 300 years ago. The throne room remained silent long after every whispered conversation had disappeared. Luca Moretti did not reach for the drawing immediately. Instead, he stood several feet away, studying every line as though the paper itself might vanish if he moved too quickly. His advisors exchanged uncertain glances but dared not interrupt. The ancient symbol woven into the silver branches was impossible to ignore. It had not appeared in any surviving record for more than 3 centuries, and every historian believed it had vanished with the final keeper of an old promise that no living human could possibly remember. Carefully, Luca stepped closer and lifted the page from the throne. The paper felt ordinary, cheap notebook stock. The corners were slightly bent. Faint traces of blue crayon dust still clung to the surface. Nothing about it suggested mystery except the image itself. A lonely king sat beneath bare branches while a little girl held a lantern high above him. Hidden among those branches rested the forgotten crest, drawn with remarkable precision by hands far too young to understand what they had created. One of the senior advisors quietly cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, should we secure the estate?" Luca continued studying the picture without looking up. No, his calm answer surprised everyone. "Find the child." The words carried no anger, no urgency, only quiet certainty. Within minutes, the household staff began searching every hallway, garden, and service corridor. No alarms sounded, no one raised a voice. Blackstone Manor operated with disciplined silence, making the search feel strangely gentle despite its importance. Charlotte was completely unaware. She had returned to the employee lounge after wandering through the mansion, happily coloring another page while swinging her feet beneath the chair. She was sketching birds now, tiny blue ones flying through golden clouds. Her mother continued organizing cleaning supplies in a nearby storage room, assuming her daughter had never left the waiting area. A soft knock interrupted Charlotte's drawing. She looked up to find an elderly housekeeper smiling kindly from the doorway. "Miss Charlotte?" the woman asked. Charlotte blinked. "How do you know my name?" The woman smiled a little wider. "Someone would like to meet the artist responsible for a very interesting picture." Charlotte's first reaction was embarrassment. She immediately remembered her mother's warning about touching things that did not belong to her. Her shoulders lowered. "Am I in trouble?" "No one has said you are." The answer was truthful, but somehow it did not calm her. She quietly followed the housekeeper through hallways that suddenly seemed much larger than before. Afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass, covering polished floors with shifting colors that moved beneath their footsteps. Every employee they passed paused respectfully, not because of Charlotte, but because they sensed someone important waiting ahead. Less than 100 yards away, Luca had dismissed everyone except 2 trusted attendants. The drawing rested upon a long oak table, books whose pages had grown fragile with age. None contained the forgotten crest exactly as Charlotte had drawn it, close perhaps, similar in shape, never identical. That unsettled him more than he wished to admit. What Charlotte did not know was that someone else inside the mansion had already begun asking a far more dangerous question. If a human child could reproduce an extinct royal symbol without instruction, then perhaps the symbol had never truly disappeared at all. The thought spread quietly through the household like an approaching storm. Charlotte finally reached a pair of towering wooden doors. They opened slowly. The enormous chamber beyond looked different now that people occupied it. The black throne remained at the far end beneath towering windows, but the drawing she had left there was gone. Instead, a tall man dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit stood beside a long table, sunlight outlining his pale features without warming them. Charlotte immediately recognized him as the owner of the estate. He did not appear frightening. He appeared impossibly still. Luca looked at the little girl for several silent seconds before lowering his eyes to the second picture she still carried in her hands. This one showed blue birds circling an old oak tree. There were no mysterious symbols, no hidden crests, only innocent imagination. He spoke with surprising gentleness. "Charlotte, would you tell me where you learned to draw those silver branches?" She looked down at the picture on the table, then back at him with complete confusion. What silver branches? And for the first time in hundreds of years, Luca realized the child honestly had no idea what she had created. Charlotte tilted her head, genuinely puzzled by the question. She looked again at the drawing resting on the oak table, searching for whatever seemed so important to the adults surrounding her. All she saw was the lonely man, the lantern, and the tree she remembered drawing while waiting for her mother. The silver branches Luca Moretti described looked no different from ordinary branches in her eyes. She shrugged softly. "I just drew a tree." The room fell silent once more. Luca watched every small expression cross the child's face. There was no hesitation, no careful invention, only the longed to someone too young to understand deception. One of the attendants shifted uneasily beside the table. "Your Majesty, perhaps someone showed her an old illustration." Luca slowly shook his head. "Someone who knows that symbol would never leave it on my throne." His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet certainty. Charlotte lowered her eyes, worried she had somehow disappointed everyone. "I am sorry if I made a mistake." The apology hung gently in the air. Luca looked at the frightened little girl, then at the drawing again. Nothing about her resembled the people who had once searched obsessively for forgotten royal secrets. Her sneakers were worn. The sleeves of her sweater had been stitched twice by careful hands. A tiny box of colored pencils peeked from her backpack, each pencil sharpened unevenly from years of use. She looked exactly like what she claimed to be, a child who loved to draw. "You did not make a mistake," Luca finally said. "I only wish to understand." Charlotte nodded with cautious relief. "My teacher says every picture starts before your hand knows it." Several advisors quietly exchanged confused looks. To them it sounded like the innocent imagination of a second grader. To Luca the sentence carried an uncomfortable familiarity. Somewhere inside the oldest library beneath Blackstone Manor rested a weathered journal containing nearly identical words written centuries earlier by an artist whose work had disappeared from history. He pushed the thought aside before anyone noticed the brief change in his expression. Charlotte's mother suddenly appeared at the entrance, breathless after learning her daughter had been escorted through the estate. She immediately apologized. "I am so sorry. She must have wandered away. She knows she should not touch anything." Charlotte lowered her head again, expecting another lecture. Instead, Luca stepped toward them with measured calm. "Your daughter has damaged nothing." Her mother looked surprised. "She has not?" Quite the opposite. The answer confused everyone except Luca himself. He glanced once more toward the drawing before carefully sliding it into a protective leather folder normally reserved for historical documents. Charlotte noticed the unusual care and smiled shyly. "Do you really like it that much?" Luca paused for a heartbeat before answering. "It may be the most valuable drawing in this house." Charlotte giggled, assuming he was joking. Her mother looked embarrassed, convinced the wealthy estate owner was simply trying to comfort an anxious child. Neither realized he meant every word. Afternoon slowly faded into evening as grey clouds outside surrendered to soft amber light. Employees finished their work while preparations began for everyone's departure. Charlotte packed away her coloring book, believing the strange conversation had finally ended. Unfortunately for her, it had only begun. Less than a mile away, inside a secure archive beneath the mansion, two historians carefully compared Charlotte's drawing against dozens of sealed manuscripts. Every comparison reached the same impossible conclusion. The symbol matched no surviving copy because every surviving copy was incomplete. Somehow the little girl's drawing contained details that had been missing from history itself. Back upstairs, Charlotte zipped her backpack and noticed one colored pencil rolling across the polished floor. It stopped directly at Luca's shoes. He bent down, picked it up, and examined the faded silver pencil. It was almost too short to hold comfortably. "This is your favorite color, is not it?" he asked gently. Charlotte smiled. "It was my grandma's. She always said silver helps people remember things they forgot." The smile slowly disappeared from Luca's face. He carefully returned the pencil to her tiny hand without saying another word. Because 300 years earlier, the last royal artist had once spoken those exact same words before vanishing forever. The drive home should have erased the strange events of the afternoon, yet Charlotte spent the entire ride staring out the passenger window instead of coloring another picture. The setting sun painted the highway in soft shades of orange while autumn trees drifted past in quiet rows. Her mother assumed the child had simply grown tired after a long day. She smiled gently and reached across the center console to squeeze Charlotte's hand. "Thank you for behaving so well," she said. Charlotte nodded, but her thoughts remained inside the enormous mansion. She could not explain why the man in the black suit had looked at her drawing with such sadness. She had seen adults admire children's artwork before. Parents taped pictures to refrigerators, teachers pinned them to classroom walls, but no one had ever looked at a crayon drawing as though it carried the weight of an entire lifetime. Back at Blackstone Manor, the atmosphere had quietly changed. Staff members completed their evening duties exactly as they always did, yet conversations became noticeably softer whenever they passed the Royal Library. Inside that secluded room, Luca Moretti stood before a massive oak desk covered with fragile journals, faded maps, and sketches collected across centuries. Charlotte's drawing rested carefully beneath a sheet of protective glass. He had examined every line repeatedly, searching not only for answers but for mistakes. There were none. The forgotten crest remained perfectly balanced within the branches, exactly where ancient records suggested it should appear. Unfortunately, every surviving manuscript ended before that final detail had ever been preserved. An elderly archivist carefully adjusted his glasses before speaking. Your Majesty, if the child has never studied these records, then someone must have taught her indirectly. Luca closed another weathered book. Or memory survives in ways we have forgotten. The archivist hesitated. Inherited memory? Luca did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the dark windows where evening shadows slowly covered the gardens. I do not believe coincidence survives for 300 years. Meanwhile, Charlotte arrived at the small apartment she shared with her mother on the 3rd floor of an aging brick building outside Boston. The hallway smelled faintly of laundry detergent and fresh bread from the bakery downstairs. Their apartment was modest but warm. Family photographs filled one shelf. Second-hand furniture filled another. Charlotte immediately removed her backpack and carefully placed her colored pencils on the kitchen table before helping set out dinner. It was a simple meal of tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches, but she never complained. Halfway through dinner, she suddenly remembered the silver pencil. "Mom, yes, sweetheart. Did Grandma ever work in a castle?" Her mother laughed softly. "No. Why would you ask that?" Charlotte stirred her soup slowly. She used to say silver helps people remember things they forgot. Her mother's smile faded into quiet nostalgia. She did say that. Where did she learn it? I honestly do not know. She loved old stories. Sometimes she collected antique books from flea markets. Maybe one of those books. Charlotte accepted the answer even though it somehow felt unfinished. Later that evening she wandered into her bedroom, opened the small wooden box her grandmother had once given her, and carefully placed the silver pencil inside beside several smooth river stones, ticket stubs from museums, and pressed autumn leaves. They were ordinary keepsakes collected over years of childhood adventures. Nothing about the little box suggested hidden importance. Less than an hour later, far across the city, Luca received a report that surprised even him. Investigators had quietly reviewed every public record connected to Charlotte's family: employment history, school enrollment, medical files, residential addresses. Everything appeared completely ordinary. No links to forgotten estates, no connection to ancient organizations, no unexplained disappearances. Nothing except one small detail almost everyone overlooked. Charlotte's grandmother had spent 23 years volunteering every Saturday at the Boston Museum of History, restoring damaged sketches donated by private collectors. Luca read that single sentence twice before placing the file aside. Restoration work required patience, precision, and an unusual eye for details that others ignored. Perhaps that explained nothing. Perhaps it explained everything. He walked toward a locked cabinet hidden behind shelves of old books and removed a narrow velvet case untouched for decades. Inside rested a single silver stylus engraved with the same forgotten crest hidden inside Charlotte's drawing. Time had darkened the metal, but the craftsmanship remained unmistakable. Luca placed the stylus beside the child's picture. The proportions matched perfectly. For several long moments he simply stood there, listening to the silence filling the library. What Charlotte did not know was that the simple question she had asked over dinner had already become the first thread connecting two families separated by centuries. And before another sunrise arrived, someone else would begin searching for the little girl whose innocent drawing had awakened a history the world believed had been lost forever. Morning arrived wrapped in a thin layer of October fog, and Charlotte hurried through the front doors of her elementary school, carrying the same faded backpack she had owned for nearly 2 years. The excitement of yesterday already felt like a dream. Her classmates talked about homework, soccer practice, and the upcoming fall festival while she quietly slipped into her seat near the classroom window. Mrs. Peterson greeted every student with her usual cheerful smile before announcing the day's first art assignment. "Today we are drawing a place where someone feels welcome," she said as she handed out fresh sheets of paper. Crayons immediately scraped across desks as children began filling blank pages with colorful houses, playgrounds, and family kitchens. Charlotte stared at her empty page for a long moment. Without thinking, her hand began moving. She drew another enormous chair beneath tall windows. This time she added warm sunlight pouring across the floor instead of shadows. Small birds rested on the armrests. Fresh flowers surrounded the steps. The lonely chair no longer looked abandoned. It looked like someone was finally coming home. She smiled without understanding why that image felt right. Across the city, Luca Moretti had not slept. He rarely needed to, but this night had been different. Every hour had been spent reviewing forgotten journals, faded correspondence, and unfinished sketches preserved inside Blackstone Manor's private archives. None answered the question that refused to leave him. How could an ordinary child recreate details erased from recorded history? Shortly after sunrise, a quiet knock echoed through the library. The elderly archivist entered carrying another leather folder. "We found something else," he said carefully. Luca accepted the folder without speaking. Inside rested a photograph taken almost 20 years earlier during a museum charity event in Boston. Volunteers stood together in front of a restored medieval exhibit. Among them smiled Charlotte's grandmother, holding a sketchbook against her chest. At first glance, the image appeared completely ordinary. Then Luca noticed the pendant hanging around the elderly woman's neck. It was small, silver, nearly hidden beneath her sweater, but its shape matched the forgotten crest perfectly. The archivist lowered his voice. "The museum inventory confirms that pendant never belonged to any exhibit." Luca closed the folder slowly, then someone entrusted it to her. Back at school, Charlotte proudly carried her finished drawing toward Mrs. Peterson's desk. The teacher admired the colorful birds and warm sunlight before pointing toward the enormous chair in the center. "That is an interesting throne," she observed. Charlotte blinked. "A throne? It certainly looks like one." Charlotte laughed softly. "I thought it was just a really big chair." Mrs. Peterson smiled and pinned the picture onto the classroom bulletin board beside dozens of cheerful autumn paintings. Neither of them noticed another parent volunteer standing nearby, watching the conversation more closely than anyone else. The woman offered a polite smile before quietly leaving the classroom. Less than 30 minutes later, a discreet message arrived at Blackstone Manor, confirming that Charlotte had once again drawn the mysterious chair without any instruction. Luca read the report twice before placing it beside the earlier files. He was beginning to notice a pattern. Charlotte never intentionally recreated forgotten history. She simply drew whatever appeared naturally beneath her pencil. Every important detail emerged only after she stopped trying to think about it. That afternoon, Charlotte returned home carrying another gold star sticker proudly attached to her notebook. She raced upstairs, eager to show her mother the newest drawing. They laughed together while hanging it on the refrigerator with a small fruit-shaped magnet that had been there since Charlotte was 5 years old. Their apartment felt warm, ordinary, and completely untouched by the mysteries unfolding elsewhere. Unfortunately for them, someone had already photographed that classroom drawing before it ever left the school. The image traveled through secure channels until it finally reached Blackstone Manor shortly before sunset. Luca studied the second drawing in silence. The throne was the same. The sunlight was new, so were the birds, but what captured his attention rested near the bottom corner of the page. Barely visible beneath one flower, Charlotte had absent-mindedly sketched another tiny silver mark. Different from the forgotten crest, yet strangely connected to it. Luca opened an ancient journal one final time before the evening ended. For the first time since this mystery began, he found an identical symbol waiting inside the margin of a page that had never before seemed important. And beside it, written in faded ink older than the United States itself, appeared a single unfinished sentence that made the quiet library feel colder than ever before. "When the child begins drawing the path, the keeper will finally find the throne again." Rain began falling just before dawn, tapping softly against the windows of Charlotte's apartment as another ordinary school day quietly began. She stood on a chair beside the kitchen counter, helping her mother pack a peanut butter sandwich into a small paper lunch bag. The silver pencil rested safely inside its wooden box on the bookshelf, exactly where Charlotte had left it the night before. She reached for her backpack, paused for a second, then smiled at her mother. "Can I take Grandma's pencil to art class today?" Her mother hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Just promise you will bring it home." Charlotte hugged her tightly before running toward the front door. Neither of them noticed the old wooden box remained slightly open after the pencil was removed. Across the city, Luca Moretti stood beneath the glass ceiling of Blackstone Manor's conservatory while grey clouds rolled over the estate. He held the copied photograph of Charlotte's newest drawing beside the weathered journal discovered in the archives. The unfinished sentence continued to occupy his thoughts. "When the child begins drawing the path, the keeper will finally find the throne again." The archivist entered quietly, carrying another sealed folder. "We located the museum records connected to Charlotte's grandmother." Luca accepted the documents, restoration schedules, volunteer logs, and donation receipts. Nothing unusual appeared until the final page. It listed a private collection that had been delivered anonymously nearly 25 years earlier. The collection included damaged sketches, broken silver tools, and one unidentified notebook that had never been catalogued because the owner reclaimed it only 3 days later. No visitor name had been recorded, only a single handwritten instruction remained attached to the file. Preserve the child if the drawings ever return. Luca slowly lowered the page. No one in the room spoke. The sentence had clearly been written decades before Charlotte was born. Meanwhile, Charlotte's classroom buzzed with excitement as students prepared colorful decorations for the upcoming fall festival. Mrs. Peterson rolled out fresh paper across several tables before announcing a collaborative mural celebrating the town's history. Every child would contribute one small drawing. Charlotte happily selected the silver pencil instead of her usual crayons. She lightly traced the outline of an old oak tree near the center of the mural. Then she added several birds perched among the branches. Finally, without thinking, her hand continued moving. Thin silver lines slowly stretched beneath the roots, weaving across the page like gentle streams before disappearing beneath another student's drawing of a schoolhouse. Charlotte stopped and frowned. She did not remember deciding to draw those lines. She quietly erased part of one root, replacing it with grass instead. Unfortunately, the silver marks remained faintly visible beneath the paper. Less than a mile away, the parent volunteer who had quietly observed Charlotte earlier in the week photographed the nearly completed mural before anyone else entered the classroom. She smiled politely, thanked Mrs. Peterson for allowing her to help, and walked calmly toward the parking lot. 10 minutes later, the image reached a secure mailbox monitored by Blackstone Manor. Luca studied the photograph almost immediately. His eyes ignored the schoolhouse, pumpkins, playgrounds, and smiling stick figures created by dozens of children. Instead, they followed Charlotte's barely visible silver lines beneath the tree roots. He placed the image beside an ancient map preserved beneath protective glass. Every quiet curve matched an abandoned network of underground passageways hidden beneath land that now belonged to the city of Boston. The similarity could not be dismissed as coincidence any longer, yet the greatest mystery remained unchanged. Charlotte still showed no awareness of what she was creating. That afternoon, classes ended beneath clearing skies. Charlotte waved goodbye to her friends before walking toward the pickup area where her mother usually arrived after finishing a morning cleaning shift. While waiting, she sat on a bench and opened her sketchbook. A little boy nearby accidentally dropped his box of crayons. Without hesitation, Charlotte knelt to help gather them. She handed back every color except one silver crayon that had rolled beneath the bench. Smiling, she added it to the little boy's box before saying, "Silver always helps people remember." The child laughed, thanked her, and ran away. Charlotte smiled too, never realizing she had repeated the same sentence for the third time in only 2 days. At that exact moment inside Blackstone Manor's library, Luca uncovered one final page hidden inside the old journal's damaged binding. Unlike every previous page, this one contained no illustrations at all. Only a carefully written instruction remained, preserved across centuries in faded ink. It read, "Do not search for the keeper before the path reveals itself, because the keeper will always appear as a child who does not know she is leading anyone home. Some truths do not arrive with thunder. They arrive as quiet confirmations that everything you believed was impossible has already happened." 3 mornings after discovering the final journal page, Luca Moretti made a decision that none of his advisors expected. Instead of sending investigators, historians, or security personnel to watch Charlotte from a distance, he drove into Boston alone. His black sedan blended easily with morning traffic as office workers filled the sidewalks and school buses disappeared through busy intersections. He parked half a block from Charlotte's elementary school and remained inside the car, hidden behind lightly tinted windows. He was not there to question her. He simply wanted to observe what an ordinary morning looked like for the child who had unknowingly awakened centuries of forgotten history. Charlotte skipped toward the school entrance, carrying her backpack with the familiar silver pencil tucked safely inside. She stopped halfway across the playground when she noticed the school's elderly groundskeeper struggling to lift several heavy flower pots after the weekend rain. Without hesitation, she hurried over and carefully carried the smallest one to the greenhouse. The old man thanked her with a warm smile. Charlotte answered with the same gentle kindness she offered everyone. She did not know anyone was watching. Luca remained perfectly still inside the car. Every ancient document described the keeper with remarkable detail. Not wealth, not extraordinary intelligence, not unusual strength. Every account repeated the same forgotten quality. The keeper always chose kindness before curiosity. He finally understood why every search conducted over centuries had failed. They had searched for someone extraordinary. History had been waiting for someone ordinary. Later that morning, Mrs. Peterson announced that the class would spend an hour inside the school library researching local landmarks for the fall festival. Charlotte wandered through the children's history section until a faded picture book slipped halfway off a shelf. She caught it before it fell. The cover showed an illustration of colonial Boston beneath a full moon. Curious, she opened it. Most pages contained simple drawings of churches, bridges, and marketplaces. Near the center of the book rested a fold-out illustration of an enormous oak tree that had once stood on land now occupied by modern buildings. Charlotte smiled immediately. She recognized the shape of its branches, not because she had seen the picture before, but because she had drawn that same tree several times without realizing it. She traced one finger across the page, then quietly copied the tree into her sketchbook. This time she added the familiar silver roots almost automatically. At that exact moment, nearly 10 miles away beneath Blackstone Manor, an elderly archivist unfolded a centuries-old survey map across a stone table. The map showed the exact location of the original described in the old journal. When he overlaid a transparent copy of Charlotte's latest drawing onto the survey, every silver root aligned with remarkable precision. Even the smallest curves matched forgotten pathways sealed beneath the city long before the first skyscrapers had ever been built. The archivist immediately called Luca. The message reached him before Charlotte's lunch period had even begun. He read only one sentence before quietly closing his phone. There was no longer any reasonable explanation. Charlotte was not remembering history because someone had taught her. She was revealing pieces of it exactly as the journals had predicted. School ended beneath bright blue skies. Charlotte climbed into her mother's pickup truck and happily described the library book she had discovered. "There was a giant tree that looked just like one I always draw," she said excitedly. Her mother smiled while merging into afternoon traffic. "Maybe you have a good imagination." Charlotte nodded. "Maybe." She never mentioned the silver roots because she assumed everyone drew trees that way. Back at Blackstone Manor, Luca unlocked a chamber that had remained sealed for generations. Dust floated through pale afternoon light as he approached a wooden easel standing alone in the center of the room. Resting upon it was an unfinished painting created more than 300 years earlier by the last royal artist before she disappeared from every historical record. Luca carefully uncovered the canvas. The throne was there, the lantern was there. Even the silver branches matched Charlotte's first drawing almost perfectly. Only one detail had never been completed. The face of the little child standing beside the throne remained entirely blank, as though the artist had known someone else would finish the story centuries later. Saturday arrived with crisp autumn air and bright blue skies, and Charlotte could hardly contain her excitement as her mother surprised her with a trip to the Boston Museum of History. It had become their favorite tradition ever since Charlotte's grandmother had passed away. Whenever they could afford the bus fare, they spent an afternoon wandering through old exhibits, pretending every artifact carried a forgotten adventure waiting to be discovered. The museum welcomed families with polished wooden floors, enormous skylights, and quiet galleries filled with paintings, maps, and handwritten journals protected behind glass. Charlotte wandered from room to room with wide eyes, reading every small description even when she did not fully understand the words. Her mother smiled from a few steps behind, grateful that history fascinated her daughter more than expensive toys ever had. Neither of them knew that Blackstone Manor had quietly funded the museum's restoration department for nearly 50 years. Less than 20 minutes after they arrived, Luca Moretti entered through a private staff entrance connected to the museum archives. His visit had been scheduled weeks earlier to review several newly restored collections, but when he received notice that Charlotte was inside the building, he quietly postponed every meeting without explanation. He instructed the curator that the family should never realize they were being observed. This was not an investigation anymore. It was confirmation. Charlotte eventually stopped before a large oil painting showing Boston nearly 300 years earlier. The city looked smaller, the streets narrower, the harbor filled with wooden sailing ships instead of modern ferries. Near the edge of the painting stood an enormous oak tree overlooking the settlement. Charlotte smiled immediately. "Mom," she whispered, "that is the tree again." Her mother studied the artwork for several seconds before nodding. "I guess you really do like drawing old trees." Charlotte tilted her head. "It feels like it is waiting for someone." Her mother laughed softly. "Trees are patient." They continued walking until they reached a temporary exhibit dedicated to historic artists whose names had gradually disappeared from public memory. Most visitors passed through without much interest. Charlotte did not. One unfinished charcoal sketch immediately captured her attention. It showed a stone chair beneath tall windows, but time had faded nearly every detail except the outline. She stared quietly at the display without understanding why her heartbeat suddenly felt louder. The museum guide approached with a friendly smile. "Beautiful, is it not?" Charlotte nodded. "Who finished it?" The guide looked almost disappointed. "No one ever did." The artist vanished before completing it. Charlotte frowned thoughtfully. Maybe she was waiting for the right person. A few feet away, hidden among other museum guests, Luca heard every word. He remained perfectly still. 3 centuries earlier, the unfinished painting inside Blackstone Manor had shown the same throne. Now an unfinished museum sketch inspired the same answer from the same child, without either image revealing the complete story. Coincidence had become mathematically impossible. Later that afternoon, Charlotte and her mother joined a free family workshop where children could copy simple historical drawings using pencils provided by the museum. Charlotte politely thanked the instructor but quietly removed her grandmother's silver pencil instead. She selected a blank sheet and began sketching the unfinished chair she had just admired. The room buzzed with cheerful conversation while parents praised colorful drawings of ships and colonial houses. Charlotte barely noticed. Her hand moved with gentle confidence. She completed the chair, then she added the familiar oak tree beyond the windows. Birds settled along the branches, sunlight streamed across the floor. Finally, almost absent-mindedly, she drew a tiny lantern resting beside the throne instead of floating above it. When she finished, she leaned back with a satisfied smile. "There," she whispered. "Now nobody has to hold it anymore." At that exact moment, less than 50 feet away inside the museum archives, a restoration specialist carefully opened the anonymous notebook once borrowed decades earlier by Charlotte's grandmother and recently rediscovered inside an untallowed storage cabinet. Most pages remained blank from age, but one folded sheet slipped free as the notebook opened. Written across the brittle paper in elegant handwriting were the words every historian had overlooked for generations. "The keeper will never inherit the throne. The keeper will simply remind its guardian that he was never meant to stand there alone." When Luca read the sentence only moments later, he slowly closed his eyes. For the first time in centuries, the lonely throne inside Blackstone Manor no longer felt like the center of an ancient kingdom. It felt like a promise that had been waiting for a little girl with a silver pencil to quietly bring it home. Monday morning arrived wrapped in golden sunlight, and Charlotte walked to school carrying more excitement than usual. The museum visit still filled her thoughts, especially the unfinished sketch that had somehow felt strangely familiar. During breakfast, she had carefully folded her newest drawing and slipped it inside the front pocket of her backpack, hoping to show Mrs. Peterson how she imagined the old chair should have looked after the artist finished it. To Charlotte, it was simply another picture. To history, it was becoming something much greater. Across the city, Luca Moretti remained inside Blackstone Manor's oldest library, surrounded by every drawing Charlotte had unknowingly created over the past week. They covered the enormous oak table in careful chronological order. The first showed loneliness, the second introduced sunlight, the third welcomed birds, the fourth placed a lantern beside the throne. Individually, they appeared like ordinary children's artwork. Together, they formed a complete sequence, almost as though someone had been patiently restoring a forgotten story one page at a time. The elderly archivist studied them beside Luca before quietly speaking. "She is not drawing random pictures anymore." Luca nodded. "She is finishing something that history left unfinished." Neither man noticed the morning light reaching the final drawing first, illuminating the lantern before touching any other part of the page. At school, Mrs. Peterson smiled warmly as Charlotte proudly unfolded her newest artwork. Several classmates gathered around, admiring the detailed tree and glowing lantern. One little girl pointed toward the empty throne and asked the obvious question, "Where is the king?" Charlotte looked at the picture for several thoughtful seconds before answering with complete sincerity, "Maybe he is finally taking a walk." The children laughed softly before running outside for recess, but Mrs. Peterson remained unusually quiet. There was something comforting about Charlotte's answer. The lonely chair no longer represented power, it represented rest. Later that afternoon, the teacher carefully placed Charlotte's drawing inside a folder labeled Outstanding Student Artwork, intending to display it during the upcoming fall festival. She had no idea another quiet observer was once again volunteering inside the school office. Before leaving the building, the same parent volunteer discreetly photographed the newest picture and quietly forwarded it through the same secure channel that had carried every previous drawing. Less than an hour later, Luca received the image. He stared at it for a long time before opening the anonymous notebook recovered from the museum archive. Earlier pages contained scattered observations written by an unknown hand. This time, another folded sheet slipped loose from the worn binding. The faded handwriting continued the unfinished thought discovered 2 days earlier. When the guardian finally leaves the throne willingly, the kingdom will remember compassion before authority. Luca slowly read the sentence again. Every drawing Charlotte had created pointed toward the same quiet transformation. None celebrated a powerful ruler sitting above others. Every picture gently invited him to step down and walk among them instead. The realization settled over him with unexpected clarity. The forgotten prophecy had never been about protecting a throne. It had always been about healing the man who believed he could never leave it. That evening, Charlotte and her mother stopped at a small neighborhood grocery store on the way home. While waiting in line, Charlotte noticed an elderly woman struggling to reach a can from the highest shelf. Without hesitation, she climbed onto the bottom rail of the shopping cart, reached carefully, and handed the can down with a bright smile. The grateful woman thanked her warmly. Charlotte simply shrugged. Everybody needs help sometimes. Her mother smiled with quiet pride. Across the aisle, an elderly gentleman wearing a dark overcoat observed the brief exchange before calmly walking away. Charlotte never recognized him because he had removed the tailored suit that usually surrounded him with quiet authority. Luca carried only a simple shopping basket containing bread, tea, and fresh fruit. For the first time in centuries, he had entered an ordinary grocery store without attendants, advisors, or ceremony. He watched Charlotte disappear through the automatic doors, holding her mother's hand. Then he looked around at families laughing together beneath ordinary fluorescent lights. Suddenly, the enormous throne waiting inside Blackstone Manor seemed farther away than it had ever felt before. As he quietly placed another loaf of bread into his basket, he finally understood the lesson the little girl had been drawing all along. A king could preserve a kingdom from a throne, but only a humble heart could truly belong to the people living beyond its walls. And somewhere inside Charlotte's backpack, the newest drawing rested peacefully, still unfinished in one small corner where a single empty path waited for someone else to decide whether to draw the next step. The following Saturday, Blackstone Manor opened its gates for the first time in years to host a charity exhibition supporting children's art programs across Massachusetts. Local schools had been invited to display selected student artwork inside the estate's newly restored gallery, and Mrs. Peterson proudly chose one of Charlotte's drawings without realizing how deeply it would affect the man who owned the mansion. Charlotte bounced with excitement as she stepped through the familiar entrance beside her mother, this time carrying herself with far more confidence than during her first unexpected visit. The grand hall no longer felt frightening. Sunlight poured through the towering stained glass windows, replacing the cold silence she remembered with the gentle sound of conversation and children's laughter. Paintings lined elegant walls while families wandered from display to display admiring the young artist's creativity. Charlotte smiled each time someone paused to compliment a colorful landscape or cheerful portrait painted by one of her classmates. She never expected anyone to pay special attention to her own work. Across the gallery, Luca Moretti quietly welcomed community leaders, teachers, and donors with calm courtesy rather than formal ceremony. His advisors noticed subtle changes that would have seemed impossible only weeks earlier. He spoke longer with visitors than usual. He listened instead of simply answering. More importantly, he smiled without forcing the expression. The enormous responsibility that had defined him for centuries no longer seemed to weigh quite as heavily across his shoulders. Every lesson hidden inside Charlotte's drawings had begun changing him long before he fully realized it. Eventually, Charlotte wandered into the final exhibition room where her completed throne drawing hung inside a simple wooden frame beneath a small card displaying only her first name and grade level. She stared at it proudly before whispering to herself, "It looks happier on the wall," a familiar voice answered gently behind her. Perhaps because someone finally finished the story, Charlotte turned and immediately recognized Luca. She smiled brightly instead of becoming nervous. "Hello, Mr. Moretti." "Hello, Charlotte." He stood beside her, looking at the framed drawing rather than at the little girl. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Visitors drifted through nearby exhibits, without noticing the unusual stillness surrounding them. Finally, Charlotte asked the question that had quietly followed her ever since leaving Blackstone Manor the first time. Did the lonely chair ever find someone? Luca looked toward the picture. Then, with complete honesty, he answered, yes. It reminded the person who owned it that he never needed to sit there every day. Charlotte seemed satisfied by that explanation. That is good, she said softly. Everybody gets lonely if they stay in one place too long. Her words carried no mystery. Only simple childhood wisdom, yet Luca felt them settle more deeply than any royal decree he had ever heard. Nearby, Charlotte's mother watched the conversation with quiet curiosity. She still believed the wealthy estate owner simply appreciated her daughter's artistic talent. She could not imagine that every forgotten promise preserved across centuries had quietly found its answer through ordinary kindness expressed with colored pencils and innocent questions. As the afternoon continued, children gathered around long tables to create one final collaborative mural celebrating hope for the future. Charlotte happily joined them. This time she did not draw a throne. She did not draw silver branches or hidden symbols. Instead, she painted a large park filled with families walking together beneath tall trees. Birds crossed a bright blue sky. A small lantern rested on a picnic blanket beside laughing children. At the edge of the picture stood one tall man wearing a dark coat while helping an elderly visitor plant a young oak tree. There were no crowns, no castles, no signs of power, only people sharing the same peaceful afternoon. When the mural was finished, Charlotte stepped back and smiled. Now everybody belongs. Luca quietly approached the painting after the children wandered away. He searched carefully for hidden symbols or forgotten marks, but there were none. For the first time since this extraordinary journey had begun, Charlotte had drawn nothing connected to ancient mysteries because there were no mysteries left for her to reveal. The path had been completed, the story had been restored. As evening sunlight filled the gallery with warm golden light, Luca turned toward the enormous windows overlooking the estate grounds. Workers and volunteers laughed together while loading tables into trucks. Families slowly returned home carrying handmade crafts and smiling children. He suddenly realized something remarkable. For the first time in centuries, Blackstone Manor no longer felt like a fortress protecting forgotten history. It felt like a home welcoming ordinary lives. And somewhere behind him, Charlotte laughed as another child asked if they could draw together again, never realizing that the greatest masterpiece she had ever created had not been a picture at all. It had been the quiet transformation of a lonely heart that finally remembered how to step away from its throne. The days following the exhibition passed with a peaceful rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar inside Blackstone Manor. For generations, the estate had guarded ancient traditions, priceless records, and carefully preserved silence. Now children's laughter seemed to linger in its hallways long after the charity event had ended. Volunteers returned to collect decorations. Teachers sent handwritten thank you notes, and photographs from the exhibition appeared in local newspapers celebrating the success of the community fundraiser. Charlotte clipped one small newspaper article and proudly taped it beside her refrigerator with the same fruit-shaped magnet that had held so many of her drawings. She smiled every time she walked past it, believing the happiest part of the weekend had simply been sharing her artwork with other children. She never imagined she had changed anything beyond that. At Blackstone Manor, however, quiet changes continued unfolding one after another. Luca Moretti no longer spent every evening inside the sealed throne room. Instead, he began walking through the estate gardens before sunset, greeting groundskeepers by name and asking gardeners about newly planted flowers. The employees noticed immediately. Conversations became easier. Even the oldest staff members admitted the mansion somehow felt warmer despite the approaching winter. No announcement had been made, no ancient law had been rewritten, yet everyone sensed that something invisible had finally shifted. One afternoon, the elderly archivist approached Luca while carrying the anonymous journal that had guided so much of their search. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "there is one final page." Luca looked up with mild surprise. They had examined the fragile notebook countless times. "I believed we had already read every remaining sheet." "So did I." The archivist carefully opened the weathered binding one last time. A folded page that had remained sealed by age slowly separated from the back cover. The ink had faded almost beyond recognition, but enough remained to read the closing paragraph. Together they stood in silence as the archivist gently spoke the words aloud. If the guardian learns compassion before the keeper learns the truth, then the promise has already been fulfilled. The child must never carry the burden of the old kingdom. Let her keep only the joy that guided her hand. The room remained completely still. Luca slowly closed the journal himself before returning it to its protective case. For the first time since Charlotte's drawing appeared on the throne, every question had finally received an answer. She had never been chosen to inherit forgotten responsibilities. She had never been meant to enter a hidden world or sacrifice an ordinary childhood. Her only purpose had been to restore what loneliness had nearly erased. Once that was complete, history itself instructed everyone to leave her life untouched. Across the city, Charlotte spent the same afternoon helping Mrs. Peterson decorate the classroom for Thanksgiving. Paper leaves covered bulletin boards, while students wrote short notes describing what made them grateful. Some children wrote about bicycles. Others wrote about grandparents, pets, or vacations. Charlotte carefully printed her answer using neat second-grade handwriting. "I am thankful that people do not have to stay lonely forever." Mrs. Peterson paused after reading the sentence. She smiled warmly and pinned Charlotte's paper in the center of the display without saying another word. That evening, Luca quietly drove through Boston once more. He parked across the street from Charlotte's apartment building just as families returned home after work. Children played tag beneath glowing streetlights while parents carried groceries inside. Charlotte laughed with two neighborhood friends as they chased fallen leaves across the sidewalk before waving goodbye and climbing the apartment stairs. Luca watched only long enough to see her disappear safely through the front door. Then he started the engine again. He did not need another mystery solved. He did not need another drawing explained. The promise preserved across 3 centuries had asked only one final thing of him: protect the ordinary life that had restored an extraordinary heart. As he drove away, he placed the old silver stylus inside a small wooden box beside the anonymous journal before locking both inside the estate archives forever. They would remain preserved not because someone might need them again, but because their purpose had already been fulfilled. High above the city, the first stars slowly appeared beyond the autumn clouds, while Charlotte sat at her bedroom desk, drawing nothing more mysterious than birds flying above a neighborhood park. There were no forgotten symbols hidden among the branches, no secret pathways beneath the trees, only bright skies, smiling families, and one little girl who had unknowingly completed the oldest unfinished story anyone at Blackstone Manor had ever carried. The week before Thanksgiving arrived with cold mornings and bright afternoons, and life settled into the kind of peaceful routine Charlotte loved most: school, homework, helping her mother with dinner, and filling another sketchbook with ordinary moments became enough again. She no longer felt the quiet pull toward mysterious chairs or forgotten trees. Her drawings overflowed with neighborhood parks, squirrels chasing acorns, children flying kites, and families walking beneath colorful autumn leaves. Whatever invisible path had guided her hand before had gently faded away, leaving only the imagination of a happy 8-year-old girl. Her mother noticed the change without understanding it. One evening, while placing freshly folded laundry into Charlotte's dresser, she paused beside the growing stack of sketchbooks. Smiling, she turned a few pages and laughed softly. "Your birds have become very busy lately," Charlotte grinned. They finally found places they like. It sounded like an ordinary answer, yet somewhere far across the city another person would have understood exactly what she meant. At Blackstone Manor, preparations quietly began for the annual community Thanksgiving dinner that Luca Moretti had decided to open to local families for the first time in living memory. Previous generations had treated the estate as something distant, admired from outside iron gates but rarely entered by ordinary people. This year would be different. Long banquet tables replaced formal reception furniture, the grand ballroom filled with volunteers instead of dignitaries. Local bakeries donated pies. Neighborhood florists decorated every table with handmade centerpieces. The estate no longer resembled an isolated monument to forgotten history. It looked like a place waiting to welcome neighbors. Several senior advisors privately questioned the unusual decision, but none challenged it. They had watched the quiet transformation unfold day by day. The change had not weakened their king. It had simply reminded him why leadership existed in the first place. 2 days before the celebration, Luca walked alone into the throne room carrying the first drawing Charlotte had ever placed upon the ancient seat. The paper remained carefully preserved beneath museum-quality glass. He stood before the black throne for several silent moments before gently lifting the framed drawing from its protective case. Then, instead of returning it to the throne, he carried it across the room and hung it beside a tall window where warm afternoon sunlight could reach it every day. The throne remained exactly where history required it to stand, but the drawing no longer belonged there. It had become a reminder rather than a mystery. As golden light spread across the picture, the lonely chair drawn by a little girl seemed almost alive beneath the afternoon sun. Luca smiled quietly before leaving the room without looking back. Meanwhile, Charlotte's class spent Friday assembling small Thanksgiving cards for senior citizens living alone throughout the city. Mrs. Peterson encouraged every child to write one sentence that might brighten someone's day. Some children wrote cheerful holiday wishes. Others drew smiling turkeys or pumpkins. Charlotte carefully folded her card before writing only a few simple words beneath a small picture of two birds sitting together on the same branch. "I hope today reminds you that someone is thinking about you." Mrs. Peterson read the message and gently placed Charlotte's card at the top of the collection. She had long ago stopped wondering why such thoughtful kindness came so naturally to one little girl. On Thanksgiving morning, families from across the community gathered beneath the open gates of Blackstone Manor, carrying homemade dishes, laughter, and grateful hearts. Charlotte and her mother accepted an invitation from the school district without realizing who had personally requested that every participating family be welcomed. Children played on the estate lawn while volunteers served warm meals beneath colorful tents. Musicians performed soft jazz near the gardens. Elderly neighbors shared stories with young students who listened politely. There were no speeches celebrating ancient traditions, no formal ceremonies honoring powerful names. Only ordinary people enjoying an ordinary holiday together. Charlotte wandered toward the gardens after lunch and noticed a newly planted oak tree surrounded by fresh mulch and wooden supports. A small brass plaque rested beneath its branches. It did not mention forgotten kingdoms, vanished artists, or mysterious promises. It simply read, "May every generation leave this place kinder than they found it." Charlotte smiled, gently touched one small leaf, and skipped back toward her mother without asking who had planted it. From a nearby terrace, Luca watched the little girl rejoin her family before quietly looking toward the young tree swaying beneath the clear November sky. The old prophecy had ended exactly as it was always meant to end. Not with crowns, secrets, or forgotten power, but with kindness taking root where loneliness had once stood. Winter arrived quietly in Boston, covering rooftops with the season's first gentle snowfall, while life continued exactly as it should. Charlotte still hurried to school every morning wearing the same knitted scarf her grandmother had made years before. She still filled sketchbooks faster than her mother could buy them. She still stopped to help anyone carrying something too heavy or standing alone too long. The mysterious silver symbols never returned. The forgotten pathways remained hidden beneath history where they belonged. And little by little the extraordinary weeks surrounding one simple drawing became nothing more than a happy childhood memory she could never fully explain. She remembered the beautiful mansion. She remembered the kind man with calm eyes who would ask thoughtful questions about her artwork. She remembered the enormous chair that no longer seemed lonely after she had left her picture behind. Everything else slowly faded the way childhood mysteries often do, leaving only warmth where confusion once lived. At Blackstone Manor, another tradition quietly changed forever. The ancient throne room remained preserved with the same dignity it had carried for centuries, yet its massive doors were no longer kept permanently closed. Students visiting during educational tours occasionally walked through the grand chamber while learning about art restoration, architecture, and local history. They admired stained glass windows, hand-carved stonework, and paintings rescued from time. Most noticed the great black throne standing beneath the towering ceiling. Few noticed the framed child's drawing hanging beside the eastern window where morning sunlight reached it first every day. Those who asked about the picture always received the same simple answer from the estate guides. A young artist once reminded this house why kindness matters. Nothing more needed to be said. Luca Moretti never corrected them. Some stories became stronger when they belonged to everyone instead of only one person. On the final afternoon before Christmas break, Mrs. Peterson asked every student to create one last drawing representing what home meant to them. Charlotte smiled before opening a brand new sketchbook. Her silver pencil had finally become too short to use comfortably, so she carefully placed it inside the little wooden keepsake box at home several days earlier. This time she reached for an ordinary graphite pencil instead. Slowly she filled the page with a cozy apartment building, glowing windows, snow-covered sidewalks, birds resting in bare branches, and her mother standing beside the front door holding 2 steaming mugs of hot chocolate. Near the corner of the picture she added a young oak tree wrapped in tiny white lights. There were no castles, no thrones, no hidden symbols. Only the quiet beauty of an ordinary life surrounded by love. Mrs. Peterson looked at the finished drawing and smiled. "This feels peaceful." Charlotte nodded happily, because everybody is already where they belong. That same evening, Luca stood beside the eastern window of the throne room, watching snowflakes drift silently across the estate gardens. The young oak tree planted after Thanksgiving had already gathered a thin blanket of snow across its branches, yet it stood firmly rooted against the cold. He glanced toward Charlotte's first drawing hanging beside the window. The lonely chair beneath silver branches no longer looked lonely at all. Morning sunlight, afternoon laughter, and changing seasons had become part of the picture itself. He quietly realized something remarkable. The drawing had never changed. He had. Without another word, he extinguished the last candle in the throne room and walked away, leaving the doors open behind him. Warm light from the main hall gently spilled across the ancient stone floor where darkness had once lingered alone. Miles away, Charlotte finished decorating a small paper star before taping it inside her bedroom window. Snow continued falling beyond the glass while her mother called her into the kitchen to bake holiday cookies together. Charlotte laughed, jumped from her chair, and ran down the hallway without looking back at the unfinished sketchbook resting on her desk. It did not need another drawing tonight. Outside, birds settled quietly among the branches of neighborhood trees as soft snow covered the streets below. Far beyond the city, the young oak at Blackstone Manor stood beneath the same peaceful sky, its roots reaching deep into the earth while its branches stretched patiently toward the light, and in 2 different places connected by nothing more than an act of unexpected kindness. 2 hearts finally understood the same timeless truth. No throne becomes meaningful because someone sits upon it. It becomes meaningful only when the person worthy of it remembers to stand beside everyone else.